The December wind howled across the frozen prairie of Wyoming Territory with the fury of a wild beast, carrying snowflakes that cut like tiny knives and temperatures that could kill an unprepared traveler within hours. 10-year-old Matthew Carlson, huddled behind a pile of firewood outside his stepmother's cabin, his thin body shaking uncontrollably as ice crystals formed on his ragged clothes, and his breath came in desperate gasps that created small clouds of vapor in the merciless air. Matthew had been banished from the warmth of the cabin 3 hours earlier when his stepmother, Ruth Carlson, had decided that his presence was no longer welcome in what had once been his father's home. The woman who had married his father just 2 years before the man's death from pneumonia had made it clear from the beginning that Matthew was an unwanted burden, a reminder of her husband's previous life that interfered with her plans to start fresh with her own biological son. "You're nothing but another mouth to feed," Ruth had snarled as she shoved Matthew out into the storm, her face twisted with the kind of cruelty that came from a heart incapable of love or compassion. "Your father's dead, and I don't owe you anything. Find somewhere else to live because you're not welcome in my house anymore." The casual dismissal of a 10-year-old child into a blizzard that was already claiming the lives of experienced frontiersmen was an act of such breathtaking cruelty that it would have shocked even the hardest hearts on the frontier. But Ruth Carlson was a woman whose capacity for selfishness seemed to know no bounds, someone who viewed children as inconveniences rather than precious lives worthy of protection and care. Matthew pressed himself deeper into the meager shelter provided by the woodpile, trying to find some protection from the wind that seemed determined to steal every bit of warmth from his small body. His father's old coat, which had been too large when it was given to him and was now threadbare from constant wear, provided little defense against the killing cold that was beginning to penetrate his bones. The boy's mind drifted back to better times when his father was still alive and their small cabin had been filled with warmth and laughter instead of hostility and neglect. William Carlson had been a good man, a homesteader who worked hard to provide for his family and who had loved his son with the kind of fierce devotion that made Matthew feel safe and valued despite the harsh realities of frontier life. But those days had ended abruptly when pneumonia claimed William's life during the previous winter, leaving Matthew at the mercy of a stepmother who had never wanted him and who saw his father's death as an opportunity to rid herself of an unwanted responsibility. Ruth's own son Peter, who was 2 years older than Matthew, had inherited his mother's cruel nature and seemed to take pleasure in tormenting his stepbrother whenever the opportunity arose. "Please, God," Matthew whispered through chattering teeth, his voice barely audible above the howling wind, "don't let me die out here. I know I'm just a kid, and I know I don't have anyone left who cares about me, but please don't let me freeze to death in the snow." The prayer was offered with the desperate faith of a child who had nowhere else to turn. Someone who understood that his survival now depended on forces beyond his own control. Matthew had learned to be self-reliant during the months since his father's death, but no amount of determination could protect him from the kind of weather that was beginning to claim his strength and consciousness. As the hours passed, and the cold penetrated deeper into Matthew's core, he began to experience the early stages of hypothermia that preceded death by freezing. His thoughts became confused and disjointed. His shivering stopped as his body began to shut down non-essential functions, and a dangerous drowsiness began to cloud his mind with the false promise of rest that was actually the approach of death. It was at this critical moment, when Matthew's life hung by the thinnest of threads, that the sound of approaching hoofbeats penetrated the howling of the storm. Through the swirling snow, the boy could make out the shape of a lone rider approaching. The cabin, Someone brave enough or desperate enough to be traveling in weather that had forced every sensible person to seek shelter. The rider was a man of perhaps 40 years, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors in all kinds of weather. His name was James Mackenzie, a Scottish immigrant who had come to Wyoming Territory 5 years earlier to establish a cattle ranch in the remote valleys where hardy men could build something lasting if they were willing to work hard and face whatever challenges the land could offer. James had been caught in the storm while returning from a supply run to the territorial capital, and he was seeking shelter for himself and his horse before the weather claimed both their lives. As he approached the Carlson cabin, his attention was caught by what appeared to be a pile of rags near the woodshed, something that seemed out of place in the organized chaos of a frontier homestead. Dismounting from his horse and leading the animal toward what he hoped would be temporary shelter, James's blood ran cold as he realized that the pile of rags was actually a child, barely conscious and clearly dying from exposure to the killing cold. "Sweet Jesus," James whispered, his Scottish accent becoming more pronounced in moments of strong emotion. "What kind of monster leaves a child out in weather like this?" Without hesitation, James gathered the semi-conscious boy into his arms, noting with alarm how cold and lifeless Matthew's small body had become. The child was barely breathing, his lips were blue with hypothermia, and his skin had taken on the waxy pallor that indicated advanced stages of freezing. James pounded on the cabin door with his free hand, his voice carrying across the wind with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "Open this door. There's a child out here who's nearly frozen to death." Ruth Carlson appeared at the door after several minutes, her face showing irritation at being disturbed rather than concern for the dying child in James's arms. Behind her stood Peter, watching the scene with the kind of cold interest that suggested he was enjoying his stepbrother's suffering. "That's just Matthew," Ruth said dismissively, as if explaining the presence of an unwanted animal. "He's not welcome in this house anymore. I told him to find somewhere else to live." The casual cruelty of her response hit James like a physical blow, and he felt anger building in his chest like a wildfire catching dry grass. "You turned a 10-year-old child out into a blizzard?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that wise people recognized as far more dangerous than shouting. "He's not my responsibility," Ruth replied, with the kind of selfish indifference that revealed the true darkness of her character. "His father's dead, and I don't owe the boy anything. If he can't take care of himself, that's not my problem." James looked down at the dying child in his arms, then back at the woman who had condemned him to death through her heartless abandonment, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "You're right," James said quietly, his voice carrying a finality that made Ruth step backward despite herself. "He's not your responsibility anymore. He's mine now." Without another word, James turned away from the cabin and carried Matthew toward his horse, his mind already focused on the desperate race against time that would determine whether the boy could be saved from the effects of prolonged exposure. Ruth called out behind him, her voice showing the first signs of uncertainty as she realized that her actions might have consequences she hadn't anticipated. "You can't just take him. There are legal procedures, territorial authorities who handle these things. The only authority that matters right now is keeping this child alive," James replied, without turning around. "If you want to involve territorial officials in explaining why you tried to murder a 10-year-old boy, I'm sure they'd be very interested in hearing that story." The threat of legal consequences for what amounted to attempted murder through abandonment seemed to penetrate Ruth's self-centered worldview for the first time, and she watched in silence as James secured Matthew on his horse and prepared to ride back into the storm. As they began the treacherous journey toward James's ranch, Matthew drifted in and out of consciousness, dimly aware that someone was fighting to save his life, but too weak to understand the full implications of his rescue. The warmth of James's body and the protection of the man's heavy coat began to work against the hypothermia that had nearly claimed him, offering the first hope he had felt since being cast out into the storm. "Hold on, lad," James murmured as they made their way through the driving snow toward his ranch house, his voice carrying the kind of gentle encouragement that Matthew hadn't heard since his father's death. "You're going to be all right now. I've got you, and I'm not going to let anything happen to you." The promise was made to a semi-conscious child who couldn't fully understand the words, but something in James's tone penetrated Matthew's failing consciousness and gave him the strength to keep fighting for survival. For the first time in months, he wasn't alone in his struggle against a world that seemed determined to destroy him. As James's ranch house appeared through the swirling snow like a beacon of salvation, Matthew began to understand that the lone rider who had found him dying in the cold had given him something far more valuable than rescue from immediate danger. He had been given a second chance at life, and possibly at finding the kind of family and belonging that had died with his father. James Mackenzie's ranch house emerged from the blizzard like a fortress against the elements, its solid log construction and glowing windows promising the warmth and safety that could mean the difference between life and death for the boy whose frozen body he carried through the storm. The Circle M Ranch had been built with the understanding that Wyoming winters were not merely cold, but actively hostile to human survival, and every aspect of its design reflected James's determination to create a sanctuary that could withstand whatever nature could deliver. The main house was a substantial two-story structure surrounded by well-built outbuildings that spoke of prosperity, earned through hard work and careful planning. James had spent 5 years transforming a remote valley into a thriving cattle operation, building not just a business, but a home worthy of the family he hoped someday to have. The irony that his first opportunity to share that home would come through such tragic circumstances was not lost on him as he carried Matthew toward the warmth that might save the boy's life. "Mrs. Chen," James called out as he shouldered through the front door, his voice carrying the urgency of someone dealing with a life-threatening emergency. "I need hot water, warm blankets, and whatever medical supplies we have. I've got a child here who's nearly frozen to death." Li Chen, the Chinese woman who served as James's housekeeper and cook, appeared immediately from the kitchen, her experienced eyes taking in the situation with the kind of quick assessment that came from years of dealing with frontier emergencies. She had fled California during the anti-Chinese violence of the previous decade and had found sanctuary working for James, who valued competence and character over racial prejudices that infected too many frontier communities. "Aya," Mrs. Chen murmured, using the Cantonese expression of dismay as she saw Matthew's unconscious form and the obvious signs of severe hypothermia. "This child is nearly dead from cold. Quick, bring him to the kitchen where it's warmest." James carried Matthew to the kitchen, where the large cast-iron stove radiated the kind of heat that could penetrate even advanced hypothermia, and carefully placed the boy on a makeshift bed of blankets near the warming fire. Mrs. Chen worked with practiced efficiency, removing Matthew's frozen clothing and wrapping him in warm blankets, while checking for signs of frostbite and other cold-related injuries. "His breathing is very shallow," Mrs. Chen observed, her voice carrying the concern of someone who understood how close to death the boy had come. "Body temperature dangerously low. We must warm him slowly, or shock could kill him faster than—" "And cold," James nodded, recognizing the wisdom in Mrs. Chen's approach, despite his desire to do everything possible as quickly as possible to save Matthew's life. He had seen men die from cold during his years in Wyoming, and he understood that the warming process required as much care as the initial rescue. As they worked together to gradually restore warmth to Matthew's body, James found himself studying the boy's face and trying to understand what kind of life had led to such desperate circumstances. Matthew was clearly undernourished. His clothes were little more than rags, and his hands showed the calluses and scars that came from hard physical labor inappropriate for someone his age. "Mrs. Chen," James said quietly, "what kind of person abandons a child to die in a blizzard? What kind of darkness lives in someone's heart that they could watch a 10-year-old boy freeze to death and feel no remorse?" "Some people have no heart," Mrs. Chen replied simply, her own experiences with cruelty and abandonment giving weight to her words. "Some people see children as burdens instead of blessings. But this child found you, Mr. James, and that means his story is not over yet." As the hours passed and Matthew's body temperature gradually returned to normal ranges, James and Mrs. Chen maintained their vigil, watching for signs of consciousness and monitoring his breathing and pulse. The boy's recovery was slow but steady, suggesting that the hypothermia hadn't progressed to the point of causing permanent damage. It was near dawn when Matthew's eyes finally fluttered open, consciousness returning with the kind of confusion that typically followed severe trauma. For a moment, he didn't recognize his surroundings, and panic flashed across his young face as he struggled to understand where he was and whether he was safe. "Easy, lad," James said gently, moving into Matthew's line of sight so the boy could see his face. "You're safe now. You're in my home, and no one's going to hurt you here." Matthew's eyes moved around the warm kitchen, taking in the concerned faces of the adults who had clearly been caring for him, the comfortable surroundings that spoke of genuine hospitality and the obvious signs that he was no longer fighting for survival in the frozen wilderness. "Am I dead?" Matthew asked quietly, his voice hoarse from the cold and the trauma he had endured. "Is this heaven?" The innocent question brought tears to Mrs. Chen's eyes and made James's throat tighten with emotion as he realized how close they had come to losing this precious young life to the cruelty of adults who should have protected him. "No, son," James said gently. "You're very much alive, and you're in my ranch house in Wyoming Territory. My name is James Mackenzie, and this is Mrs. Chen, who helped take care of you while you were recovering. Mrs. Chen makes special soup," the housekeeper added with a warm smile. "Help you get strong again. You need good food and rest to heal from cold." Matthew tried to sit up, but weakness from his ordeal made the simple movement difficult, and James quickly moved to help support him. "Take it easy," James said. "You've been through quite an experience, and your body needs time to recover fully." "Sir," Matthew said hesitantly, "I don't understand why you helped me. Ruth said I wasn't anyone's responsibility anymore, that I didn't matter to anybody." The echo of his stepmother's cruel words in the boy's voice made James's anger flare again, but he kept his tone gentle and reassuring as he responded to Matthew's confusion. "Son," James said firmly, "every child matters to someone, and you matter to me now. What that woman did to you was wrong, and you're never going to face that kind of treatment again as long as I have anything to say about it." "But where will I go?" Matthew asked, the question revealing his understanding that his rescue, however welcome, was only a temporary respite from the larger problem of having nowhere to belong. "I don't have any family left, and Ruth made it clear I'm not welcome." Back there, James exchanged a meaningful look with Mrs. Chen, who nodded with the kind of encouragement that suggested she approved of the decision he was about to make. "Matthew," James said carefully, "how would you feel about staying here permanently, about becoming part of my family and helping me run this ranch? I could use a smart young man who's willing to learn, and I think we could build a good life together." The offer was so unexpected that Matthew stared at James in stunned silence, hardly daring to believe that the nightmare of the past months might actually be ending in such an incredible way. "You would want me to stay?" Matthew asked, his voice filled with wonder. "Even though I don't have anything to give you in return, even though I'm just an orphan boy with no money or property?" "Son," James said with a smile that transformed his weathered face. "You've already given me something more valuable than money or property. You've given me the chance to do the right thing, to use what I've built here for a purpose beyond just making myself comfortable." Mrs. Chen beamed with approval as she ladled soup into a bowl for Matthew, clearly pleased with the direction the conversation was taking. "Mr. James, good man," she said firmly. "He take care of people who need help. You be safe here, young master." As Matthew slowly ate the nourishing soup that Mrs. Chen had prepared, he began to process the magnitude of what was being offered to him. Not just shelter and food, but genuine family membership with people who seemed to value him for who he was, rather than viewing him as a burden to be endured. "Mr. Mackenzie," Matthew said formally, "I would be honored to stay here and help you with your ranch. I can work hard, and I learn quickly, and I promise I won't cause you any trouble." "Just James," the rancher said with a laugh that filled the kitchen with warmth. "And you don't have to promise not to cause trouble. Boys are supposed to cause a little trouble now and then. It's part of growing up properly." The casual acceptance of his essential boyhood, rather than demands for adult behavior beyond his years, was something Matthew hadn't experienced since his father's death. For the first time in months, he felt like he might actually have a chance to be a child again instead of just surviving from day to day. Over the following days, as Matthew recovered his strength and began to explore his new home, he discovered that James Mackenzie was indeed the kind of man who kept his promises. The Circle M Ranch was run with efficiency and fairness. The men who worked there were treated with respect, and the atmosphere was one of purposeful cooperation rather than fear and harsh discipline. "Matthew," James said one morning as they stood on the porch watching the sun rise over the snow-covered valley, "I want you to understand something important. You're not here as hired help or as someone who has to earn his keep through constant work. You're here as my son, and while I expect you to contribute to the ranch as you're able, your primary job is to grow up healthy and happy and educated." The distinction between being valued for his work and being valued for his essential worth was something Matthew was still learning to understand, but he sensed that it represented a fundamental difference in how James viewed children compared to how Ruth had treated him. "James," Matthew said quietly, "I think my father would have liked you. He always said that the measure of a man wasn't what he owned, but how he treated people who couldn't do anything for him in return." The boy's mature insight into character and his obvious love for his deceased father impressed James with its wisdom, and suggested that Matthew possessed the kind of moral foundation that would serve him well throughout his life. As winter gradually gave way to spring, and Matthew settled into his new life at the Circle M Ranch, both he and James began to understand that the blizzard that had brought them together had been more than just a rescue from immediate danger. It had been the beginning of a family bond that would grow stronger with each passing year, transforming a lonely rancher and an abandoned boy into father and son in every way that truly mattered. Subscribe to our channel now to see how Matthew's new life unfolds and what incredible adventures await this newfound father and son. Don't miss the next chapter of this heartwarming story. 5 years had passed since that terrible winter night when James Mackenzie found Matthew Carlson dying in a blizzard, and the transformation in both their lives during that time was profound beyond anything either could have imagined. The Circle M Ranch had evolved from a successful but lonely operation into a true home, filled with laughter, purpose, and the kind of deep familial bonds that made hardship bearable and joy complete. Matthew, now 15, had grown into a young man whose character reflected the best qualities of both his biological father's moral foundation and James's practical wisdom. He was tall for his age, with the kind of lean strength that came from years of ranch work, and his green eyes held an intelligence and confidence that impressed adults throughout the territory. But more importantly, he possessed the security that came from knowing he was valued and loved unconditionally, something that had transformed him from a frightened, desperate child into someone who could face the future with hope and determination. James, meanwhile, had discovered that fatherhood suited him in ways he had never anticipated. The man who had built his ranch through careful planning and solitary determination had found that sharing his achievements with someone he loved made everything more meaningful and worthwhile. Teaching Matthew about cattle, horses, land management, and the complex business of running a successful operation had given James a sense of purpose that went far beyond mere financial success. "Matthew," James said one spring morning as they rode together across the vast pastures where Circle M cattle grazed contentedly in the warming sun, "I've been thinking about your future, about what kind of education and opportunities you'll need to make your mark in the world." Matthew straightened in his saddle, recognizing the serious tone that James used when discussing important life decisions. Over the years, these conversations had become precious to him, moments when James treated him as an equal partner in planning their shared future rather than simply issuing parental directives. "What specifically have you been thinking about?" Matthew asked, though part of him dreaded the possibility that James might be considering sending him away to school or encouraging him to leave the ranch that had become his sanctuary and home. "The territorial legislature is establishing a new agricultural college in Laramie," James explained, "designed to train young men in the scientific methods of farming and ranching that are revolutionizing agriculture throughout the West. I think you should consider applying for admission when you turn 18. The suggestion filled Matthew with conflicting emotions, combining excitement about educational opportunities with anxiety about leaving the security of the Circle M ranch and the family he had found there. "Would you want me to come back here after college?" Matthew asked carefully. "Or would you expect me to use that education to build something of my own somewhere else?" James smiled at the question, recognizing the deeper concerns that lay beneath Matthew's practical inquiry. "Son," he said gently, "this ranch belongs to both of us now, and it always will. Whether you choose to expand our operation here, start your own spread elsewhere, or pursue entirely different opportunities, you'll always have a home at the Circle M." The reassurance that his place in James's life was permanent rather than conditional helped ease Matthew's anxiety about the future, while opening his mind to possibilities he had never dared to consider. "I'd like to learn more about scientific agriculture," Matthew said thoughtfully, "but I'd also like to expand what we're doing here, maybe develop breeding programs for better cattle, or establish markets for our beef in the eastern cities where people are willing to pay premium prices for quality meat." The sophisticated understanding of business opportunities impressed James with its maturity, confirming his belief that Matthew possessed the intelligence and vision to build something significant regardless of which path he chose to pursue. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a rider coming from the direction of town, someone traveling with the kind of urgency that usually indicated important news or potential problems. As the horseman drew closer, they could see it was Sheriff Tom Bradley, whose presence at the ranch typically meant official business that required James's attention as one of the territory's most influential citizens. "James, Matthew, Sheriff," Bradley called out as he reined in his horse. "Glad I found you both together. I've got some news that I think you'll want to hear." "What kind of news, Tom?" James asked, noting the satisfaction in the sheriff's expression that suggested whatever he had to report was positive rather than problematic. "It's about Ruth Carlson and her son Peter," Sheriff Bradley replied, his voice carrying the kind of grim satisfaction that came from seeing justice finally served. "They've been arrested by federal marshals on charges of fraud and theft. Turns out they've been forging land claims and selling property they didn't own to unsuspecting settlers." The news hit Matthew like a physical blow, not because he felt any sympathy for his former stepmother, but because it represented the final chapter in a story that had begun with such pain and betrayal. Ruth's arrest meant that her ability to hurt anyone else had come to an end, but it also brought back memories of the fear and desperation he had felt during those terrible months before James rescued him. "What's going to happen to them?" Matthew asked quietly, his voice showing the maturity that had come from learning to process difficult emotions without being overwhelmed by them. "Federal prison, most likely," Sheriff Bradley replied. "The fraud charges carry serious penalties, and they've apparently been running this scheme for several years across multiple territories. They'll be lucky if they see freedom again before they're old and grey." James placed a protective hand on Matthew's shoulder, recognizing that news about his stepmother would inevitably bring up painful memories, despite the years of healing and security that had followed his rescue. "How do you feel about this, son?" James asked gently, understanding that Matthew's reaction to Ruth's downfall would reveal important things about the man he was becoming. Matthew was quiet for a long moment, considering his emotions carefully before responding. "I feel sorry for the people they cheated," he said finally, "and I'm glad they can't hurt anyone else. But I don't feel happy about their punishment exactly. It's more like justice, I suppose. They chose to hurt people, and now they have to face the consequences of those choices." The mature response impressed both James and Sheriff Bradley, with its balance of moral clarity and emotional wisdom, suggesting that Matthew had indeed grown into someone who understood the difference between justice and revenge. "There's something else," Sheriff Bradley continued, his expression showing the kind of awkwardness that preceded sensitive topics. "Ruth's arrest means that the property she inherited from your father reverts to you as his rightful heir. It's not much, just the small homestead and a few head of cattle, but it's legally yours now." The revelation that Matthew had inherited property from his biological father was unexpected, representing a tangible connection to the man whose memory had sustained him through his darkest moments. "What condition is the property in?" James asked, his practical mind already considering the implications of Matthew's inheritance. "Pretty run down," Sheriff Bradley admitted. "Ruth never maintained it properly, and it's been mostly abandoned since she moved to town to run her fraud operation. But the land is good, and with some work it could be productive again." Matthew looked at James, seeking guidance about how to handle this unexpected inheritance and its potential impact on their family arrangements. "It's your decision, son," James said firmly. "That property is part of your father's legacy, and you should do whatever feels right to you." "I'd like to restore it," Matthew said after careful consideration. "Maybe use it as a breeding operation for the Circle M, or as a place where we could train young men who want to learn ranching. But I'd want to do it as part of our family operation, not as something separate from what we've built together." The generous spirit behind Matthew's decision, choosing to honor his father's memory while maintaining the family bonds that had saved his life, filled James with pride at the man his adopted son was becoming. 2 years later, as Matthew prepared to leave for agricultural college in Laramie, the restored Carlson homestead had indeed become an integral part of the Circle M operation, serving as both a memorial to William Carlson's memory and a training facility where young men could learn the skills necessary for success in ranching. The farewell dinner that Mrs. Chen prepared for Matthew's departure was attended by ranch hands, neighbors, and friends who had watched him grow from a nearly dead child into a confident young man whose character and capabilities had earned respect throughout the territory. "Matthew," James said as he offered a toast to his son's future, "when I found you dying in that blizzard 7 years ago, I thought I was just saving a child's life. I didn't understand that you would end up saving mine as well, giving me the family and purpose that made everything else worthwhile." "You gave me more than life," Matthew replied, his voice thick with emotion as he looked around the table at the people who had become his family. You gave me the chance to become someone, worthy of my father's memory and your faith in me. As Matthew departed for college the next morning, carrying with him the education, values, and unshakable sense of belonging that James had provided, both father and son understood that distance would never diminish the bonds they had forged. Through shared hardship and mutual love, Matthew would go on to become one of the territory's most successful ranchers and a leader in agricultural innovation. But he would always credit his achievements to the man who had ridden through a blizzard, to save a freezing child, and had given him not just survival, but the foundation for a meaningful life. The Circle M Ranch continued to thrive under their joint management, becoming not just a successful business, but a symbol of what could be accomplished when people chose to build families based on love, rather than blood, and when strength was used to protect rather than exploit those who needed help most. The boy who had been left to freeze by a cruel stepmother had indeed found his way home. Not to the place where he was born, but to the family where he belonged, and the future he was meant to build. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow more incredible stories of rescue, redemption, and the power of chosen family from the Old West. Hit that subscribe button now and join our community of believers in second chances and the triumph of love over cruelty.